It was the sort of day that made Sedgehampton appear untouched by time. Sunlight filtered through the tall elm trees lining the lanes, dappling the gravel drive of Fairwood Grange in golden flecks. The air was thick with the scent of roses in second bloom, honeysuckle climbing the old stone walls, and something else, something less easily named. An undercurrent like the pause before a thunderclap on a clear day. Miss Jane Marple sat primly in a striped deck chair beneath a sprawling copper beech, its leaves fluttering like the pages of a leather-bound book. Her straw hat, weathered but well kept, cast a dappled shadow across her finely wrinkled face. She held her teacup with the delicate precision of a woman who had never once spilled a drop, and sipped slowly, watching the afternoon unfold with the same interest she might show to a performance at the Palladium. The fete was in full swing. Paper bunting, hand-painted by schoolchildren, flapped gently between marquee poles. Tables groaned beneath the weight of Victoria sponges, jars of damson preserve and sausage rolls arranged with military symmetry. There was even a small brass band, borrowed from the next village, whose interpretation of Greensleeves wandered in and out of tune like a sheep gone astray. The event was hosted somewhat uncomfortably by the Honorable Benedict Northwick, newly returned to the ancestral house after a long and mysterious absence. He had inherited Fairwood Grange some 10 years prior, but rumors swirled that he'd spent most of that time abroad Tangier, perhaps or Buenos Aires. No one in Sedgehampton quite knew what he'd been doing, though Mrs. Drusilla Pope suggested it had likely been something continental and disagreeable. "He has a banker's handshake," she said in hushed tones to Colonel Arbuthnot, "but not a banker's manner. He smells faintly of something foreign." "Cinnamon? Or is it sandalwood?" Colonel Arbuthnot grunted. "Probably gin." From her vantage point, Miss Marple heard all this and smiled quietly into her tea. She watched Philippa Northwick, the great niece in question, trying not to look noticed by anyone, especially her great-uncle. Philippa had the posture of someone who had been raised to be neither seen nor heard, but had recently discovered she possessed opinions nonetheless. She stood near the lemonade stand in an ill-fitting navy cardigan, her pale gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond the garden hedges. Miss Marple had spoken to her once or twice, a polite girl, studious, not prone to frivolity. She volunteered at the local library, ran arithmetic drills for the vicar's primary school students, and rode a bicycle with a bent front wheel. And yet there was something more to her watchfulness, not unlike Miss Marple's own, though more concealed. At precisely 3:30, the chatter began to quiet. Guests turned toward the old stone terrace where Benedict Northwick emerged, in his summer suit, linen creased and shoes dusty from garden paths. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the railing, his expression caught between confidence and calculation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice raised just above the wind rustling through the beech leaves, "thank you for joining. View us today at Fairwood Grange? I must say I've not hosted many such events, but I find I rather enjoy the rural cheer of it all. Tea cake, a brass band, quite grounding." The crowd tittered obligingly. A small child dropped a scone in the grass. Miss Hartley, seated beside Miss Marple, fanned herself with a folded program and muttered something about the vicar's meringues being under-whisked. Northwick continued. "There is, however, a more serious matter I'd like to share. As you may know, Fairwood Grange has been in my family for generations. I've no children of my own, and as I am not, alas, immortal, it's time to consider what comes next." A rustle passed through the crowd like wind over barley. "I have decided," he said, pausing with the deliberate air of a man who enjoys causing suspense, "to leave the estate to my great niece, Miss Philippa Northwick." All heads turned. Philippa froze. One hand reached automatically to her necklace, a simple silver chain she wore tucked under her collar. She said nothing, but her face had drained a shade paler than usual. Northwick gestured toward her. "She's bright, conscientious, and has the kind of moral fiber we all admire but rarely possess. The legal formalities will take place on Monday in London. Until then, I simply wanted everyone to hear it directly. Inheritance should never be a surprise." The applause was uncertain. A few clapped with enthusiasm, others politely, some not at all. Miss Marple noted the expressions around her. Colonel Arbuthnot was stiff, his eyes narrowed as though calculating taxes. Mrs. Pope looked thunderstruck. Miss Hartley pursed her lips and whispered, "Well, that will ruffle the peacocks." Miss Marple's eyes, keen behind her spectacles, landed briefly on a man standing near the shrubbery, a Mr. Lionel Crowthorne, Benedict's distant cousin and former business associate, who had spent the last 3 years volunteering rather aggressively on the village council. His face, ruddy from sun and indignation, gave away more than he likely intended. The fete continued, though something in the air had shifted. The music resumed, albeit faintly off-key. Someone spilled lemonade on a garden bench. The raffle for the quilted tea cozy was drawn, to little fanfare. The conversations now circled not around jam-making or bunting patterns, but inheritance laws and ungrateful relatives. Miss Marple, ever observant, caught snippets as she moved through the crowd. Wasn't even raised in the village. Doesn't know a pig from a pitchfork. What about Lionel? I thought it was understood. As the guests began to trickle away, baskets under arms and gossip trailing behind them like perfume, Miss Marple approached her. Host. Benedict was standing alone beside a weathered sundial, gazing toward the lawn with a furrowed brow. "You've stirred the waters, Mr. Northwick," she said gently. He turned, offering her a weary smile. "Miss Marple." "Yes, well, better stirred." "Now then after I'm gone, don't you think?" "Quite," she agreed, "though I dare say not everyone will feel the same." He gave a short laugh. "Let them fume. I've made my decision." "Philippa's a good girl? Practical? Kind?" "No." "Illusions, no illusions," Miss Marple echoed. "A rare trait in the young." Benedict looked at her for a moment, something flickering in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or calculation, then gave a short nod. When Miss Marple left the fete shortly after, she found Philippa lingering alone by the rusted front gate. The girl was twisting her fingers in her shawl, her eyes unreadable. "Miss Northwick," she said, gently. "A great many changes ahead for you, I imagine." Philippa startled slightly. "Yes, it doesn't feel quite real yet." "Unreal." "Things often become real quite suddenly," Miss Marple murmured. "A surprise on Saturday, a signature on Monday, and, in between, a long Sunday." Philippa's brow furrowed. "You make it sound ominous?" "I hope not," Miss Marple said quietly. "I merely observe that change makes people act. Not always in predictable ways." 2 mornings later, the news passed through Sedgehampton like fire through straw. Benedict Northwick had been found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, unresponsive. The doctor pronounced it heart failure sudden, but not impossible for a man of his age. But Miss Marple, standing at her garden gate in a pale blue cardigan, watched the village stir and buzz with the news. She felt the stillness that came before understanding. A man had named his heir on Saturday. He had planned to sign the will on Monday, and on Sunday night he died. She stirred her tea slowly, her thoughts turning like clock gears. "Curious?" she said aloud to no one at all. "Very curious indeed." By mid-morning on Monday, the death of Benedict Northwick had threaded itself into every teapot, garden gate, and telephone call in Sedgehampton. It began with the housemaid from Fairwood Grange, a timid girl named Elsie with perpetually red knuckles, who ran to the village. Constable in tears. From there, it moved swiftly like jam down a crack in a tart. "Heart failure," declared Dr. Pendlebury, a portly man with a bulbous nose and a habit of clearing his throat before delivering any pronouncement, medical or otherwise. "Quick and sudden. Died at his desk, likely writing correspondence." "Or revising his will," muttered Mrs. Drusilla Pope to no one in particular, but with the tone of someone intending to be overheard. By midday, the benches outside St. Aldhelm's Church were occupied by clusters of villagers, ostensibly enjoying the weather, but in truth analyzing every detail of the previous 48 hours. Even those who'd barely known Mr. Northwick felt entitled to an opinion. "Dead before the ink was dry," said Colonel Arbuthnot grimly, stirring his coffee with military ferocity. "What bad luck, or good luck depending on one's view." The Reverend Pottle frowned at this, though said nothing. He had never much liked Colonel Arbuthnot's fondness for cynicism in the presence of tragedy. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly on a wooden bench beside the herbaceous border of the vicarage garden, a basket of mending in her lap, and her knitting needles clicking gently. Her movements were unhurried, her expression mild, but her ears were working just as intently as her hands. "The timing is unsettling," said Miss Hartley, who had taken to courting Shakespeare since retiring. "So neat, so theatrical. Like Hamlet's uncle, if you'll forgive the comparison." "Well," said Mrs. Pope, lowering her voice, "I wouldn't be at all surprised if poison were involved. Nothing too obvious, mind you? Something subtle. Something subtle. There are things you can order through catalogs nowadays, rat poisons and tinctures and whatnot." "Do stop, Drusilla," snapped Mrs. Oxley, who had a low threshold for speculative hysteria. "The man had a heart condition." "Everyone said so, did they?" said Miss Marple, her tone light, conversational. "I don't recall hearing that myself." The table fell silent. It was true. No one had ever mentioned Benedict Northwick's health prior to his death. He had walked smartly, gardened in his shirt sleeves, and spoken without breathlessness or complaint. If he had any ailment at all, he had hidden it well. But then, as Miss Marple often observed, people were very good at hiding things, especially in small villages where politeness masked resentments like ivy-covered cracks in old brickwork. Later that afternoon, 2 men from the county coroner's office arrived at Fairwood Grange in a gray van, the sort with nondescript paneling and quiet tires. They were seen only briefly carrying out a covered stretcher, speaking in low tones to the constable. The curtains in the drawing-room had already been drawn shut. Philippa Northwick had not been seen all day. "Grief, poor girl," said Miss Hartley. "Or guilt," said Mrs. Pope, who was already forming a theory involving arsenic in a teacup. Miss Marple, as was her way, said nothing. But she did take a walk that evening, a slow stroll through the village lanes that took her, quite naturally, past the entrance to Fairwood Grange. The iron gate stood slightly ajar. A black ribbon had been tied to one of the stone pillars, fluttering faintly in the dusk. There was movement on the gravel drive. Philippa, she stood quite still beside a flower bed of faded hydrangeas, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face, when turned toward the house, was pale and taut. Miss Marple hesitated a moment, then approached. "My dear," she said softly, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." Philippa turned, startled. Her eyes were red but dry. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect, I'm sorry, I'm not really receiving visitors." "Oh, I'm not a visitor," Miss Marple said gently. "Just an old woman with a tendency to walk when the air turns cool." There was a pause. Then slowly, Philippa nodded. "It doesn't feel real." "No," said Miss Marple. "Death rarely does, not at first. And when it arrives at such a moment, well, one's mind can hardly keep up." Philippa looked away. "He was meant to sign the will this morning. In London, his solicitor was expecting him." "And instead," said Miss Marple softly, "there is no signature at all." The silence between them was filled only by the wind through the hydrangeas. "I suppose," Philippa said finally, "it means the house reverts to the default heir." "That would be Lionel, Mr. Lionel Crowthorne?" She nodded. "He was furious when Uncle named me on Saturday. Tried to act pleasant, but I could feel it, he was seething. He always thought it was his by right. And now, perhaps it is," Miss Marple murmured. "Unless something should interfere." Philippa turned toward her sharply. "Do you think—" She trailed off. "I think many people have strong feelings about property and legacy," Miss Marple said. "And strong feelings, when stirred at the wrong temperature, can become volatile." Philippa didn't answer. Her gaze had returned to the house. But something in her posture shifted, slightly more alert, slightly more uncertain. The next morning brought a flurry of official inquiries. Inspector Craythorne of the County Constabulary, lean man with sharp features and a dry voice, arrived, with questions. He spoke to the housekeeper, the cook, the gardener, and finally, Miss Philippa herself. No arrest was made, nor even a formal suspicion noted. Still, there was a faint tension in the village air, like the brittle edge of frost. Before the first freeze, Miss Marple, however, was not idle. She spent that day not visiting but observing. In the bakery, she listened to the conversation between the grocer's wife and young Mabel, who used to work weekends at the Grange. At the post office, she lingered long enough to overhear Lionel Crowthorne arguing on the telephone, though. The topic was obscured by poor manners and a great deal of slamming. And at the churchyard, while trimming dead blooms from her sister's grave, she observed the vicar speaking in unusually hushed tones to Dr. Pendlebury something about timeline, inconsistencies, and Elsie's recollection of the medicine cupboard. That evening, at precisely 6 o'clock, Miss Marple steeped herself a cup of Earl Grey and sat down at her writing desk. She removed a sheet of lavender notepaper and wrote in tidy, looping script, "The trouble with poison is that it's rarely theatrical anymore. But human nature, well, that remains gloriously predictable. Notes, Fairwood Grange case." Then she folded the page, tucked it into her notebook, and watched as the last of the evening sun slipped behind the hills. The question was no longer simply how Mr. Northwick had died. It was why now, and who needed him dead before the will could be signed. The early investigation into Benedict Northwick's death unfolded with all the gentle clumsiness of an old clock being taken apart by hands that didn't quite know the mechanism. Inspector Craythorne, though methodical, was more accustomed to petty thefts, sheep gone missing, and the occasional public disturbance after a village fete. Murder, if murder was required, a different ear, a different eye. But he was thorough, and his first act was to summon Dr. Pendlebury back to Fairwood Grange for a more formal post-mortem report. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took no part in the official proceedings. She simply listened first to the birds in her garden, then to the words that came wafting through hedges, post office doors, and church pews. On Tuesday morning she walked slowly through the center of Sedgehampton, a canvas shopping bag in hand. She stopped first at the greengrocer's for cooking apples, then at the butcher's for a half-pound of shoulder. At each stop she asked no questions but made herself visible and unthreatening presence with keen eyes and a deep knowledge of people. In the bakery, where news moved faster than yeast, Mrs. Finch was recounting the housemaid Elsie's account for what must have been the 5th time that day. She said she knocked and there was no answer. Not unusual, mind you, Mr. Northwick often worked late. But when she opened the study door in the morning, Mrs. Finch drew in her breath, slumped right over the writing desk like a puppet, with the strings cut. Did she see anything odd? A smell, perhaps? Asked a younger woman with over-tweezed brows, whose knowledge of death came mostly from the wireless. Mrs. Finch shook her head. "There's papers everywhere," she said, a half-written letter. "Cup of tea gone cold. Tea?" Miss Marple interjected gently, lifting an eyebrow as she placed a lemon-curd tart on the counter. "That would be from Sunday evening, I presume." Mrs. Finch turned, startled by Miss Marple's voice. She hadn't noticed her enter. Yes, I believe it was." "Curious," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "The maid didn't mention whether the tea had been drunk?" "No, only that it was cold." "And had he eaten supper?" "That I couldn't say." Mrs. Finch frowned. "Though Mrs. Longstaff, she's the cook, said she took up a tray. Found it untouched hours later." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile and paid for her tart. As she left the shop, she folded that information neatly into her mental ledger. Cold tea, untouched supper. A man alone in a study he'd used for years, and a maid who found him slumped like a puppet. In a village where most things moved slowly, patterns in human behavior revealed themselves with satisfying clarity if one knew how to look. Later that afternoon, the constable came down the lane past Miss Marple's cottage and stopped to tip his cap. She was pruning her roses, thin gloves stained with soil. "Busy day for you, I imagine," she said mildly. Constable Hill sighed. "That it is, Miss Marple." "The inspector's still at the Grange?" Asking everyone what they were doing Sunday night. "Not that anyone seems to know much." "No?" she said, examining a dead-headed bloom. "And what about Mr. Crowthorne?" "Lionel, he claims he left before sunset. Said he went back to his rooms in Upper Henley, alone. Can't prove it either way." "Ah," said Miss Marple. It must be such a trial to be alone when something inconvenient happens. Constable Hill looked puzzled but nodded vaguely and made his way on. Inside, Miss Marple set her gloves down and made a fresh pot of tea. As it steeped, she removed her small black notebook from the sideboard and added 2 lines in tidy blue ink. Sunday supper uneaten. Tea cold, death likely late evening. Witness statements inconsistent. Timing is key. She paused, then turned to a fresh page and jotted down 4 names. Philippa Northwick, named Heir, quiet, nervous, seemed surprised by declaration. Lionel Crowthorne, expected inheritance, furious at being passed over. Alibi uncertain. Elsie, housemaid, discovered body. Details vague. Mrs. Longstaff, cook, served Sunday supper, not questioned yet. She tapped the pen against her chin. Then, with deliberate care, she added 1 more name, Reverend Pottle, visibly troubled. Whispered to Pendlebury. The following morning, Miss Marple arranged a visit to the vicarage, under the very reasonable guise of bringing lavender biscuits to Mrs. Pottle, who was recovering from a cold. The vicar greeted her with his usual humility and a slight perspiration. About the temples, which Miss Marple noticed as she noticed all things. After delivering her well wishes to the vicar's wife, she allowed herself to linger in the drawing-room, knitting on her lap and a gentle smile on her face, I imagine. You've had a busy few days? Few days? Reverend, she said, her needles clicking softly. These unfortunate events must weigh heavily on you. Reverend Pottle hesitated, then sat across from her. It is a blow, yes. Benedict wasn't a regular churchgoer, but we spoke from time to time. He'd recently expressed an interest in reconnecting with the community, said he'd been reflecting on legacy and the burdens of ownership. Miss Marple looked up. How introspective of him. The vicar nodded. He seemed unsettled, almost as if something had troubled him deeply. I told him I was no solicitor, but I could offer spiritual advice. Did he accept it? No, he said he'd already made his decision and would put it in writing. He looked, if I'm honest, a little afraid. Miss Marple paused. Afraid? Yes, not of death, exactly. More like something he couldn't say aloud. After tea, Miss Marple thanked the vicar, gathered her knitting, and walked home through the back lane past Fairwood Grange. From the upper windows, the curtains were still drawn. The house, which had seemed so robust on Fête Day, now felt like a portrait hung in mourning. As she neared the garden wall, she caught sight of Philippa again, this time kneeling in the herb patch, her hands buried in the soil. Miss Marple hesitated, then called gently, You mustn't forget your gloves. My dear, the earth can be surprisingly cruel to delicate skin. Philippa looked up, startled. Oh, I didn't hear you. She stood and dusted off her hands, her fingers streaked with green and brown. I've been pulling weeds. It helps me think. And what have you been thinking about? Philippa hesitated, then said, I keep asking myself if I missed something, a sign. He seemed normal that evening, but maybe I wasn't paying attention. Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. Often, when tragedy strikes, we ask ourselves what we failed to notice. But sometimes, my dear, the truth is not in what we see, but in what others wish us not to. Philippa looked uncertain, then nodded. Do you think the police will? Want to speak to me again? Oh, I imagine they will, Miss Marple said kindly. But don't worry. Just tell them the truth as you understand it. As she returned home, Miss Marple stopped briefly to pick a sprig of mint from her own garden. Her mind was filled with silences, the supper tray untouched, the cold tea, the shifting looks between Lionel and Philippa, and the vicar's troubled memory. No definitive conclusion yet. But something was taking shape, the first outline of the puzzle. And Miss Marple, like a seasoned needlewoman, knew when the pattern was beginning to show itself on the underside of the canvas. By Wednesday, Inspector Craythorne had narrowed his circle of interest, not publicly, of course, but in a manner perceptible to any keen observer of human nature. The inspector had taken to standing very still when people spoke, head slightly cocked, as though the silence between words held more value than the words themselves. He also began returning to the same names again and again. Two stood out: Philippa Northwick, the unexpected heiress who never became one, and Lionel Crowthorne, the overlooked cousin who had everything to gain by the old man's untimely demise. It was in the small parlor of the post office that the speculation reached fever pitch. Mrs. Finch, having finally put out her latest tray of lemon buns, declared, "Mark my words, it'll be one of those two." Either the poor girl had second thoughts, or the gentleman cousin didn't want to wait. "But why would Philippa do it?" asked Miss Hartley, spooning sugar into her tea. "She stood to inherit. The will was days away from being signed." "Or hours," Mrs. Pope added darkly. "And what if she thought it safer to ensure no signature at all than to risk Benedict changing his mind again?" Miss Marple, seated in her usual armchair by the coal scuttle, gave a tiny shake of her head. "Young women rarely commit murder. For the sake of legacy, Mrs. Pope, if they do, it is more often to avoid scandal or protect someone they love." Her voice was quiet, almost reflective, but it hushed the room nonetheless. Miss Marple rarely contradicted anyone without a reason. Her manner, always gentle, was never vague. Meanwhile, Inspector Craythorne had summoned Lionel Crowthorne to the Grange for a formal conversation. Lionel arrived 10 minutes late, his walking cane thudding against the tiles as though declaring his irritation with every step. He was dressed impeccably in tweed and leather gloves, though the heat hardly called for either. "Let's be brief, Inspector," Lionel said, lowering himself into the study armchair, one not far from where Benedict had been found. "I trust you'll appreciate my time is not to be wasted." "Quite," said Craythorne, barely lifting his eyes from his notepad. "You stated earlier that you left the Fete around 6:30 on Sunday?" "Correct." "And went directly back to Upper Henley?" "Yes, I have rooms there. Did anyone see you return?" Lionel hesitated. "No, I let myself in. I don't keep a housekeeper." "Then no one can verify your whereabouts between 7:00 p.m. Sunday and when you were seen next?" "I was seen Monday morning," Lionel snapped. "At the tobacconist's. I bought matches." "Must I provide a receipt for everything I do?" Craythorne said nothing. The silence prickled. "I'm not in the habit of poisoning my relatives," Lionel added. "And if you're implying I am, then let's dispense with politeness and get on with it." "No implication," said the inspector calmly. "Just a routine conversation. But you were aware of Mr. Northwick's intent to change his will?" "Only because he blurted it out like a melodramatic actor in front of half the village." "And how did you feel about that?" "Irrelevant." Craythorne allowed the silence to grow again, then made a note. Lionel exhaled in frustration. Across the village, Philippa Northwick had taken to walking the gardens in long, slow circles. She had not returned to the library nor answered letters from her friends. The cook had left her meals by the door, untouched. Twice, the constable had knocked and been received with forced courtesy. Miss Marple had observed it all from afar, yet never directly intruded. Until Thursday morning. She arrived at Fairwood Grange with a tin of sultana biscuits and an expression of mild apology. "I shan't stay long," she told Philippa, who looked as though she hadn't slept in 2 nights. "But I find a visit, however small, is sometimes a relief, especially when one is surrounded by too much thinking." Philippa gave a faint smile and stepped aside. They sat in the morning room. The curtains had been opened, but only half. Dust danced in the light like memories reluctant to settle. "He believed in neatness," Philippa said suddenly. "Uncle Benedict, I mean. Every paper was dated and folded precisely. He said wills were the last dignity a man could exert over his property." Miss Marple nodded. "That sounds like him." "There was a copy of the will on his desk, or at least a draft. He'd asked me to read it Saturday night. He wanted me to be prepared." She paused. "But it was gone when they found him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Gone?" Philippa nodded. "Elsie didn't mention it to the police, I think." "She might not have known, but I saw it there, Sunday morning, folded neatly. His solicitor's address in the corner. Monday morning it wasn't there." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Perhaps someone took it." "Not because of what it said, but because it was evidence he intended to formalize it." Philippa looked up. "You think someone didn't want the will to be signed?" "I think, Miss Marple," said gently, that someone realized the hourglass was running short and acted in the narrow space before time could do its work. As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple passed Colonel Arbuthnot tending his dahlias. He saluted her with a muddy trowel and said, "Whole village is talking now. Even the vicar thinks it smells of murder." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Though the vicar smells something else too, I think guilt, perhaps, or fear." Inside her parlor, Miss Marple made a fresh pot of tea and opened her notebook again. Her writing was small but neat. Lionel. Stands to benefit, no verified alibi. Seen arguing with Benedict 3 days prior. Tone defensive. Philippa. No motive. On the surface, but frightened. Know something has changed. Something is missing. Missing document suggests someone feared its existence. She tapped her pen once against her cheek and drew a small question mark in the margin. It was time, she thought, not only to observe but to engage, to say the wrong thing in the right ear, to press gently on certain nerves and see what twitched. A proper investigation, Miss Marple knew, was not about grand discoveries, it was about tension, pressure, revealing character through unease. She folded her hands and looked out the window. The roses were blooming again, but one corner of the bed was wilting. Something buried too deep, or something poisoned at the root. Either way, she would find it. The garden was quiet that morning, bathed in the soft light of early spring. Miss Marple found herself wandering beneath the apple trees in the orchard. Behind Fairwood Grange, the faint scent of blossoms mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil. She had long learned that the most telling secrets often hid in the most overlooked places, and what better place than a forgotten garden shed, tucked behind a hedge and almost invisible to the casual eye. The shed door was ajar. Miss Marple's steps were cautious but deliberate as she pushed the door wider. Inside, dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight, settling on an assortment of gardening tools, empty flower pots, and a weathered leather satchel. She pulled on an old pair of gloves left hanging on a rusty nail, her fingers working gently through the contents. Among the usual miscellany, a slim, folded piece of paper caught her eye. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 days before Benedict Northwick's death. The ink was slightly smudged, as if written hastily or by trembling hands. The letter was addressed to no one, but its contents were unmistakable. A warning thinly veiled in polite language about someone's intentions regarding the will. Miss Marple read it twice. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, certainly not Benedict's, nor Philippa's, nor even the solicitor's carefully printed drafts she had glimpsed days before. It seemed to have been left there in haste, almost forgotten. The tone was urgent but measured. You may think your plan is secure, but the truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest shadows. Beware the watcher who sees all but speaks little. Miss Marple's mind stirred. Who had written this, and to whom? A secret correspondent? A conspirator? Or perhaps someone trying to warn the heir? She slipped the letter into her coat pocket and stepped back outside, breathing in the cool air. The letter was a thread she was determined to follow. Later that day she stopped by the village post office. The atmosphere inside was dense with speculation and undercurrents of distrust. Miss Finch, the postmistress, glanced up from her ledger and raised an eyebrow as Miss Marple entered. "I hear you've been making rounds, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Everyone's talking about the letter you found, though no one knows the details." Miss Marple smiled. "I find the smallest things sometimes reveal the largest truths." "Mrs. Finch?" Mrs. Finch shook her head, lowering her voice. "You're very discreet, you are. But I can tell you this much. There's been a flurry of letters coming and going at the Grange for weeks. Late-night post, special deliveries, some were never even stamped." Intrigued, Miss Marple pressed for more. "There was a parcel just last week," Mrs. Finch continued. "Small, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. No name on the sender or receiver. Came from London, apparently. The housekeeper said it arrived just after the solicitor left. That piece of information sat heavily in Miss Marple's thoughts. A secret parcel arriving from London around the time Benedict was preparing his will, or so it seemed. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit the solicitor, Mr. Hargrove, who had been handling the formalities. His office was a tidy, book-lined room in the nearby market town. The solicitor greeted her with polite surprise, but made no objection to her presence. "I understand you're interested in the late Mr. Northwick's affairs," Mr. Hargrove sighed, folding his hands on the polished desk. "I regret that much remains unsettled." Miss Marple produced the letter discreetly. "Might you know anything about this?" Mr. Hargrove adjusted his spectacles and read the note carefully. "No, I can't say I do. It was certainly not from my office. All correspondence has been properly documented and delivered directly to Mr. Northwick. Do you recall any unusual visits or messages around the time this letter was written?" Miss Marple asked, watching his expression. "Only the usual clients and the heir, Miss Northwick. I assure you the process has been straightforward." Miss Marple sensed the solicitor's careful words. Perhaps, she thought, some things were better left unspoken. Returning to Sedgehampton, she pondered the meaning behind the letter's cryptic warning. The watcher who sees all but speaks little, it sounded like someone who had been close, but a silent observer within the household or the village. Miss Marple's suspicions turned once again to the household staff. She resolved to speak with Elsie, the housemaid, whose nervousness and vague recollections had puzzled her since the outset. She found Elsie in the kitchen of Fairwood Grange, sitting by the window and peeling potatoes. The young woman startled slightly when Miss Marple entered, but soon relaxed under the older lady's calm presence. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if you might tell me more about the days leading up to Mr. Northwick's death. Sometimes small details, easily overlooked, are the most telling." Elsie swallowed hard, her fingers trembling. I don't know much, Miss Marple. I just found him that morning. He'd been working late, like always. But I did see Mr. Crowthorne pacing in the garden that Sunday afternoon. Did you say anything to Mr. Crowthorne?" "No. Ma'am, he seemed angry, worried, maybe. I didn't want to get involved. And the cook? Did she mention anything unusual? Any visitors you didn't expect?" Elsie hesitated, then nodded. "Mrs. Longstaff was worried about a parcel that arrived. She said Mr. Benedict seemed unsettled after it came, took it straight to his study." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The parcel from London, the secret letter, the unseen watcher-all pieces of a puzzle still incomplete. Later, she sought out Mrs. Longstaff herself. The cook was a robust woman with sharp eyes and a steady manner, accustomed to kitchen fires and village gossip alike. "Mrs. Longstaff, might I ask about that parcel you mentioned?" Mrs. Longstaff wiped her hands on her apron and frowned. I did see it, Miss Marple. Came just before last weekend." Small box, wrapped in brown paper. No name, no address. "Mr. Benedict told me to bring it to his study and not say a word. He looked tense after that. Did he open it?" "Yes, but he didn't say what was inside. Just sighed and closed the box, left it on his desk." "And the letter you found earlier, do you think it could be connected?" Mrs. Longstaff shrugged. "Could be. Mr. Benedict never liked secrets. But this one seemed to weigh on him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Secrets are like weeds, if not tended. They can choke the healthiest garden." As the day gave way to evening, Miss Marple returned home, the letter burning softly in her coat pocket. The shadows lengthened across the village lanes, and the sky blushed a gentle pink. She took up her needlework and set to mending a worn sleeve, her thoughts weaving back to the many faces she had encountered over these troubled days. A young woman burdened with expectations, a cousin simmering with resentment, a solicitor who seemed careful with his words, and servants who guarded their own quiet truths. The hidden note, the cryptic warning, hinted at deeper currents than anyone in Sedgehampton had dared to speak aloud. And somewhere in those currents, the truth lay waiting to surface. The chill in the air hinted that spring was still tentative in Sedgehampton. The village seemed caught in a quiet hush, as if it held its breath beneath the weight of unspoken suspicions and delicate truths. Even the streets seemed narrower, the cottages more tightly shuttered against the cold. Miss Marple, wrapped in her wool shawl, moved quietly through the village, her footsteps measured and unhurried. She had spent the morning visiting familiar faces, people who, beneath their everyday masks, had stories tangled in the recent tragedy. It was in the village shop that the first thread began to unravel. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, was arranging a new display of postcards when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she greeted, with an edge of something between relief and caution. "There's been talk again, things that don't add up." "Do tell," Miss Marple said, settling on a stool by the counter. Mrs. Finch lowered her voice. "Well, it's about Mr. Crowthorne. He's been seen meeting with some strangers in Henley. Men who don't belong to this part of the world. Foreign types, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you know what they discussed?" "No, but I hear there were papers." "Lots of papers. And something about settling accounts." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." Her next stop was the vicarage. Reverend Pottle was in the garden, pruning the rose bush with more force than seemed necessary. When Miss Marple arrived, he looked up, a forced smile tugging at his lips. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you came. I've been meaning to speak with you." "Is something troubling you, Reverend?" He sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "The events have stirred old memories, things I hoped were buried. There are secrets in Fairwood Grange that go beyond Mr. Northwick's passing." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging him gently. "Years ago, before I arrived here, there was a scandal involving the family. A mysterious disappearance, a woman no one talks about. Philippa's mother, I believe. She left without explanation. Some say she ran away. Others whisper darker. Tailies." Miss Marple's fingers paused over the basket of knitting in her lap. "And does this connect with the current events?" "Perhaps indirectly," the vicar replied. "There is a tension in the household. Old wounds don't heal easily. They fester beneath the surface." Miss Marple rose, her mind racing through the threads of history and present alike. "Thank you for your candor, Reverend. I shall keep this in mind." Walking back to the village center, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Philippa. The young woman had been shadowed by grief, yet beneath that sorrow lurked a wary strength. The vicar's words suggested her past was more complicated than appearances allowed. Her next visit was to the village inn, where Colonel Arbuthnot was nursing a glass of brandy by the fire. The colonel greeted her with his usual bluntness. "Miss Marple, I trust you're still on the case. Everyone's looking for answers, but most settle for guesses." "I'm more interested in facts than guesses," she replied. Settling into the opposite chair, Arbuthnot grunted. "Well, the facts are this. Lionel Crowthorne isn't the only one with motive. I've heard whispers about Philippa, about debts, about desperate attempts to keep the Grange afloat." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Village rumors are rarely reliable, Colonel, but sometimes they hold a kernel of truth," he said. "I've also noticed Philippa receiving frequent visits from a solicitor not connected to the estate. Late at night. Strange, no?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then it seems we have more to investigate." That evening at Fairwood Grange, Miss Marple was unexpectedly invited inside. Philippa had sent a note requesting a quiet conversation, away from prying ears. The drawing-room was dim, lit only by a single lamp casting long shadows. Philippa sat by the fire, a knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple," Philippa began, voice low, "about the past, about what Reverend Pottle said." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes? There are things I haven't told anyone. Not because I wanted to hide them, but because I feared what they might mean." "And what might those be?" Philippa took a deep breath. "My mother left the Grange under difficult circumstances. It was said she was reckless, unfit to care for me. But the truth is more complicated. She disappeared because of something she uncovered, something my father wanted kept quiet." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten. "And what was that?" Philippa's eyes filled with tears. "A secret about my Uncle Benedict's business dealings. Debts, promises made to dangerous people. I think my mother wanted to protect me from it all." Do you think those debts could have led to your uncle's death? Philippa shook her head. I don't know. But I do know someone wanted the will changed. Someone desperate to keep those secrets buried. Miss Marple reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Philippa's. Thank you for trusting me. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft creak of the door. Mrs. Longstaff entered, carrying a tray of tea. Her sharp eyes flickered between the two women. Miss Marple, I thought you might like something warm. As the cook set down the tray, Miss Marple caught a flicker of hesitation in her face. It was subtle, but enough. Later, after leaving the Grange, Miss Marple stood beneath the ancient oak at the village green, gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Secrets, she mused, were like shadows cast by light. They shifted, stretched, and sometimes hid more than they revealed. In the days that followed, the village seemed caught in a web of suspicion. Conversations were clipped, smiles forced, and eyes averted. But Miss Marple, ever patient, knew that pressure would eventually bring truth to the surface if only one knew where to look and when to listen. She added new notes to her ever-growing ledger, family secrets tangled with debts, Philippa burdened by past and present, unseen visitors at the Grange, tensions rising, loyalties fragile. The pieces were assembling, though the full picture remained obscured. Miss Marple settled into her chair, the flicker of lamplight catching the silver in her hair. Soon, she whispered to the night, the truth will show itself. And when it does, no shadow will be too dark to face. The sound of rain tapped gently against the window panes of St. Mary Mead the next morning, lending an air of reflective melancholy to the village. The clouds hung low over the thatched roofs and narrow lanes, and the usual bustle of village life was subdued. But beneath the gray stillness, things were beginning to stir. Miss Marple stood at her window, stirring a second cup of tea, her pale blue eyes fixed on the path outside. She had long since learned that silence was often more revealing than noise, and the events at Fairwood Grange had gone too quiet. It was just past 11 when the stillness was broken. The church bells rang unexpectedly, not the steady chime of the hour, but the clamor of alarm. By the time Miss Marple gathered her shawl and made her way through the lanes to the green, a small crowd had gathered near the vicarage. Dr. Hayward emerged from the house, his expression grim. He spotted Miss Marple at once and approached her without hesitation. "It's Mrs. Longstaff," he said quietly. "She's collapsed. Poison, most likely. I've sent for the police." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Is she?" "Alive for now, but barely." The implications settled like a frost over the gathering villagers. Another act of violence so soon after the death of Benedict Northwick suggested someone was growing desperate, or perhaps someone was being silenced. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already ticking. 2 hours later, the police arrived in force. Inspector Ainsworth, who had initially dismissed Miss Marple's quiet suggestions, looked decidedly less confident now. He met her in the drawing room of the vicarage, where she'd been permitted to wait with a pot of tea and the beginnings of a seed cake. "I suppose you'll say I told you so," he said gruffly. "Certainly not," Miss Marple replied, slicing the cake with steady hands. "But I dare say the timing of Mrs. Longstaff's incident is rather meaningful." Ainsworth sighed. She'd been acting strangely, according to the vicar. Nervous, distracted, something had unsettled her. And now she's unable to speak, for the time being. We've sent the teacup to the lab. It's clear she was poisoned deliberately. Belladonna, perhaps, or something akin. Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. If she was frightened enough to speak, or perhaps already had someone, might have felt cornered. The inspector folded his arms. "And do you believe she was trying to tell someone something?" "I do," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, but not in words. Not directly. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way once again to Fairwood Grange. The housekeeper, Doris, was reluctant to let her in, but Philippa intervened. "She's not here for gossip," Philippa said firmly. "She sees more than she says." They walked together in the conservatory. The rain had eased, leaving the glass panels dotted with silver droplets. Philippa's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "I heard about Mrs. Longstaff," she said. I can't believe it. She was always part of this house. Miss Marple studied her. She was also frightened. She'd seen or heard something. Perhaps long ago, perhaps very recently. Philippa looked away. Everyone in this house has seen something. We all carry secrets. But I never thought someone would try to kill to keep them buried. Miss Marple tilted her head. Your uncle, did he ever speak about changing the will? A long silence followed. Philippa hesitated. Yes, once. He told me he was considering leaving a larger share to someone in the village. Someone he believed had been wronged. That's curious, Miss Marple murmured. Do you know who? Philippa's voice was almost a whisper. He wouldn't say, but I assumed it was someone from the past. Someone who disappeared. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces slowly shifting. A changed will, a hidden heir, perhaps. And a secret someone had long hoped would remain buried. Miss Marple's next stop was the solicitor's office. Mr. Beale, a portly man with thinning hair and nervous eyes, greeted her with forced cheer. I'm not sure I can help you, Miss Marple. Matters of the will are highly confidential. But I believe someone tried to prevent that will from being enacted, Miss Marple said. And now a woman lies unconscious because of it. Beale's face blanched. Yes, I suppose that's possible. But my hands are tied. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone quiet but firm. Did Mr. Northwick ever ask you to draw up a revised will? Beale hesitated, then nodded. Yes, about 3 weeks before he died. He said he'd had a change of heart. He wanted to include someone who wasn't in the previous version. He gave no name, only initials, and said he'd provide full details later. Did he? No, he died before he signed the new document. We only had a draft. Where's that draft now? In my office safe, Beale said, glancing toward the inner door. But it's legally meaningless, without a signature. Nevertheless, Miss Marple said, standing, it might be the very thing that led to his death. By the time evening settled, Miss Marple had gathered enough threads to see the outline of a much darker tapestry. At home, she reviewed her notes in quiet concentration. Initials, a new heir. Unspoken secrets. Philippa's mother, the debts, Mrs. Longstaff's knowledge, a poisoning, silence enforced. She recalled something Philippa had said, that her mother left under mysterious circumstances. And now, the intended heir might bear the initials, Miss Marple thought of the parish records. She would have to visit the archive in the morning. But one final matter remained. At dusk, she made her way to the edge of the village, to a small cottage almost hidden by ivy. There she knocked softly. The door was answered by a woman in her 40s with wary eyes. She was unfamiliar to most villagers, but not to Miss Marple. Miss Elspeth Monroe? She asked gently. The woman nodded slowly. I believe you once worked at Fairwood Grange. Elspeth paled. That was a long time ago. But not so long that its consequences have faded. Miss Marple stepped inside as the door creaked open. Outside, the village lamps flickered against the thickening mist. Inside Elspeth's cottage, another piece of the puzzle was falling into place, one that had been hidden for decades under layers of shame, fear, and loyalty. Back at the Grange, a figure stood at the upper window, watching the rain-soaked road where Miss Marple had vanished. They had kept the truth buried for so long, but now it was beginning to rise. And for someone still unknown, that meant danger, real danger. The faint scent of wood smoke lingered in Elspeth Monroe's cottage, curling around the heavy curtains and the worn edges of a tapestry armchair. The little sitting room was clean but modest, with the kind of lived-in weariness that suggested retreat rather than comfort. Elspeth herself sat on the edge of her chair like someone unsure whether she was being visited or interrogated. Miss Marple, though as soft-spoken as ever, had an edge to her expression that suggested she had come here not merely for tea. I won't ask you to revisit old wounds, Miss Marple began gently, but there is something I must understand. Something that may help prevent another attempt at murder. Elspeth's eyes flicked toward the fire, avoiding Miss Marple's steady gaze. I don't know anything about Mrs. Longstaff. I haven't seen her in years. It's not her I'm truly asking about, said Miss Marple. It's Benedict Northwick. Elspeth gave a brittle, quiet laugh. Him? Whatever he did is long behind me. And yet you remained in the village, quietly, out of sight. Why not go elsewhere? Elspeth turned sharply. Because this is my home. Because I didn't want to run. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. You were once in service at Fairwood Grange. There was a scandal, I believe. Something quietly swept away. You left suddenly, and no one spoke of it again. But the records are quite plain. You were employed there in the summer of 1908. Elspeth said nothing. I don't believe Mr. Northwick ever truly forgot you, Miss Marple went on. In fact, I believe he intended to make you or your child the heir. He instructed his solicitor to revise his will accordingly. The initials M, were they for your child, Elspeth? A tremor passed over the woman's face. She rose and crossed to the fireplace, laying a hand on the mantel as though to steady herself. He said he'd fix things. He promised. But I never heard from him again. Did he ever know your child? Elspeth shook her head. No, I left before it showed. I was sent to stay with a cousin in Devon. The child was born there. A girl, and what became of her? She was placed with a family. A vicar and his wife who couldn't have children of their own. I visited her when I could. But they moved later, and I lost touch. She was raised as theirs. Miss Marple leaned forward. Do you remember the family name? Yes, Elspeth said softly. Merivale. Miss Marple blinked, then folded her hands. Philippa Merivale? Elspeth nodded slowly. Yes, she's mine. And she doesn't know. That night, the wind shifted direction, and the rain returned with a vengeance, battering shutters and seeping into the cracks of old houses. The storm had the effect of isolating the village further, as if nature conspired to draw a veil over what remained unseen. At the Grange, Philippa sat by the fire in the library, absently turning pages of a book she wasn't reading. The drawing-room clock struck 10, its chime deep and resonant. Thunder rumbled in the distance. She was startled by a knock at the door. Doris answered it, and a moment later Miss Marple entered, sodden but composed. I hope I'm not intruding, she said mildly. Philippa looked surprised but genuinely pleased. Not at all. Let me take your coat. As they settled by the hearth, Miss Marple's keen gaze observed Philippa's face, noting the shadows beneath her eyes and the flicker of uncertainty behind her polite expression. I've been thinking, Miss Marple began, as though speaking, about the curious nature of secrets, how they stretch across time and carry consequences even when forgotten. Philippa tilted her head, intrigued. You mean in relation to Uncle Benedict? In part. But more broadly, too, about family, inheritance, and responsibility. Philippa set the book down. Is there something you're trying to say, Miss Marple? Yes, said the elderly sleuth quietly, that sometimes the truth about ourselves isn't hidden from us. It's simply never offered. Philippa blinked, confused. I spoke with someone today. Someone who knew your mother very well. You mean my adoptive mother? No, Miss Marple said. I mean your real mother. The words fell into the room like pebbles in still water. Philippa sat back, her face whitening. What are you saying? Her name was Elspeth Monroe. She worked here at Fairwood Grange. She was sent away in disgrace, and she gave birth to a child who was later adopted by the Merivales? Philippa shook her head slowly. But, I've never known anything different. My parents raised you with love, no doubt. But the truth remained, hidden, not erased. Philippa rose to her feet. Her hands were trembling. And Uncle Benedict, he knew? He did. Or came to know. I believe he intended to. Restore what had once been denied. His revised will was meant to give you your rightful share. Philippa turned to the fire, struggling to absorb it. And now he's dead. Before anything was changed. Exactly. As Miss Marple left the Grange later that night, walking carefully along the edge of the village green, she knew one last move remained. A final test. It came the following afternoon, when she invited Inspector Ainsworth, Philippa, and two of the house staff, Doris and Mr. Havelock, to tea at her cottage. The invitation, under the pretext of gathering thoughts and company in uneasy times, was both charming and deliberately timed. The tea was laid with exquisite care, bone china, scones, seed cake, and a modest arrangement of violets in a pressed glass vase. Miss Marple presided gently, making small observations, watching faces more than listening to words. At one point, she passed around a faded photograph she had just found. Among old papers from a village fete in 1908, it featured several household staff from Fairwood Grange, smiling stiffly at the camera. "That's Elspeth, isn't it?" Philippa asked softly, pointing at a young woman near the corner. "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. And just beside her is Mrs. Longstaff, then Miss Barlow, and Mr. Havelock, looking rather younger. There was a faint twitch at the corner of Mr. Havelock's mouth. He laughed. "Was that really me?" "My goodness." Miss Marple smiled, but did not miss the quick, furtive glance he cast at Doris. Tea continued for some time, but the mood had shifted. Something had been quietly disturbed, memories long buried now tugged at the edges of present reality. As the guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple turned innocently to Mr. Havelock. "I do hope Mrs. Longstaff recovers. She seemed the kind of woman who wouldn't let go of a secret easily." Havelock paused in the doorway, his face stiff. "Let's hope she doesn't. Some secrets should stay buried. It was a slip. A small one, but one Miss Marple noted, like a ripple before a storm. That evening, alone again, she reviewed what she'd seen. Mr. Havelock, once a footman, now a steward, connected to Elspeth's shame, present in the household still, fearful of Mrs. Longstaff's voice, and Philippa unknowingly the rightful heir. The truth, she felt, was now fully within reach, but she would not grasp it yet. She would let it fall on its own at precisely the right moment. The test had been passed, and someone had failed it. The next morning brought a deceptive calm to St. Aldhelm. The storm had passed, leaving the village drenched but bathed in a crisp golden light. The lanes glistened, and the leaves on the hedgerows were still wet, but the air was cool and clear, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early as always. She pulled aside her chintz curtains and studied the green beyond. Mr. Sims was pedaling down the lane, his bicycle basket full of the Morning Post. A sparrow chattered from the windowsill. And just beneath, the peaceful quiet, something urgent pulsed. She dressed deliberately in her dove-gray cardigan and lilac blouse, the one she saved for visits that required a delicate touch. Today she would walk to Fairwood Grange again, not to ask questions, but to observe. The final clues were in place. Now they had to be tested. But first she had an errand. She walked to the vicarage with surprising briskness for her age. Reverend Chiswell was pruning roses in the front garden, red-faced and sweating, despite the morning chill. "Miss Marple, what a morning! The Lord certainly sends us storms and sunlight." "So he does," she replied with a warm smile. "I wonder if you might do me a favor, Reverend. I'd like to look at some of the parish adoption records from just before the war. There's something quite delicate at play, and I'd rather not go through the county clerk." He blinked. "Adoption records? That's rather unusual, Miss Marple. I quite agree. But you see, there's a young woman involved who may soon have her world appended. I'd like to ensure my suspicions are more than just village fancy." Chiswell, who had known Miss Marple long enough to trust her judgment even when it baffled him, nodded solemnly. Come in. You can have the reading room to yourself." She was there for half an hour. When she left, her eyes were faintly brighter and her expression faintly graver. At Fairwood Grange, the household had begun its uneasy return to routine. The parlor was aired out. The drawing-room clocks were once again ticking in quiet tandem. But beneath it all lay a nervous current like a tremor in a teacup. Philippa sat at the escritoire, trying and failing to write thank-you notes. Her handwriting faltered, her thoughts wandering back to her conversation with Miss Marple. She had not slept. Her dreams had been full of confused images, a child's cradle, A young woman crying in the rain, the crack of a gunshot far away. And one face kept returning to her. Mr. Havelock's. She had always thought of him as steady and silent, someone who knew the workings of Fairwood Grange better than anyone. But now she wondered, how much had he seen over the years? And how much had he chosen not to see? As if summoned by thought, Havelock appeared in the doorway. "Miss Philippa," he said, with a small bow. "Would you like the Morning Post brought to the library?" "Yes, thank you." He hesitated. "May I say, I knew your mother, Miss Monroe. I wasn't aware not entirely, that she had a child." Philippa stood startled. "You knew her?" He gave a small smile, almost regretful. "We were all young then, some of us more foolish than others. She was treated badly. I dare say I should have spoken up." "And did you ever speak to Uncle Benedict about her?" "Or about me?" His eyes flickered. "Once, briefly, but he made it clear he wanted the past left buried, until recently." Philippa studied him. There was something off in the measured tone of his voice, something too careful. "Thank you, Mr. Havelock." He nodded and withdrew, silent as ever. That afternoon, Inspector Ainsworth paid an unscheduled visit to Miss Marple's cottage. He arrived looking tired and mildly frustrated. "We're going in circles, Miss Marple. I've got Longstaff's fingerprints on the decanter, but nothing else ties her to it. She's still unconscious at the hospital. May not come to at all." Miss Marple poured him tea without comment. "And then there's that solicitor, Hugh Calthorpe," he continued. "He was the only one who knew about the new will. Says he was instructed to keep it quiet until it was signed. But it never was signed." "I rather suspect that was the plan," Miss Marple said softly. "Whose plan?" She set her teacup down. "I believe Benedict Northwick told someone else. Someone who realized the new will would cut them out. Someone who acted before it could be made legal." Ainsworth leaned in, brows knitted. "Do? You mean one of the staff? Or someone close to the staff?" "Someone who had access but no longer believed they had a claim." "You mean Havelock?" She smiled politely but did not answer. Instead, she reached into a small drawer by her side table and pulled out a folded letter. "I think you'll find this interesting. It's an extract from the parish record. Elspeth Monroe gave birth to a daughter in 1909. The child was later adopted by Reverend Merivale and his wife. Her name was Philippa." Ainsworth's jaw tightened. "So it's true, Philippa's the heir." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And that means someone else stands to lose everything. Someone who believed until quite recently that they were the natural successor." He was silent. Then he asked, "So what's your next step?" Miss Marple stood. "I shall pay Mr. Havelock another visit, and perhaps remind him of something he's forgotten." Late that evening, Miss Marple arrived once more at Fairwood Grange, her knitting bag in hand. As if it were any ordinary social call, Mr. Havelock answered the door himself. He looked surprised. "I won't take much of your time," she said, brightly, "but I came across something that belongs to you." He frowned. She reached into her bag and took out an old leather-bound notebook. "I found this tucked behind the loose panel in the butler's pantry. It has your initials?" He opened it, his face paled. Inside were pages of careful financial notations, servant schedules, and one small folded letter, yellow with age. Elspeth's handwriting. He froze. "Did you read it?" he asked. "No," Miss Marple said, "but I recognize the initials." "To J.H. that would be you, Mr. Havelock." He looked down, mouth tight. "It was a long time ago." "Indeed," she agreed. "But the past doesn't always stay buried, does it?" He looked up sharply. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You were in love with her, weren't you?" "I was," he whispered. "But she chose someone else, Northwick. And you never forgave him." He stared at her, something raw and brittle just beneath the surface. "He ruined her and then walked away. So when you heard about the will, I knew what. It meant that his mistake would be rewarded, that his child would get everything, and I who had stayed faithful, who had kept this place running for decades, I would be left with nothing." Miss Marple was quiet a long moment. Then she said very gently, "You poisoned him, didn't you?" He didn't deny it, only looked down at the book, his voice quiet. He was going to sign it that evening. I'd seen the papers in his study. I knew if I waited it would be too late. And Mrs. Longstaff? She saw me with the bottle. I didn't know she'd tell anyone. I only meant to frighten her. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. Outside, the wind stirred again. The storm, it seemed, was returning. The confession, once spoken aloud, hung in the air between Miss Marple and Mr. Havelock like thick, invisible fog. He stood with the notebook in his hands, shoulders bowed as if its weight had become suddenly unbearable. Miss Marple, seated with perfect composure in one of the Queen Anne chairs in the drawing-room, watched him with a calm that belied the intensity of the moment. "No one ever thinks the butler notices," Havelock said after a pause. "We serve the tea, we pour the wine, we polish the silver, but we hear everything, we see more than they realize." Miss Marple nodded. "People forget." "They always do. I was there when she was dismissed. Elspeth, I saw how pale she looked when she packed her things. She never told Benedict she was expecting, not that I know of, but I knew. She was too proud, too hurt." His voice wavered. "I tried to help her, but she wouldn't let me. She disappeared." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag. "You must have been very young yourself then?" 20, he murmured. "Old enough to know how the world works. Young enough to think I could change it." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a profound weariness, the sort that takes root in a man who has long since abandoned hope but continues out of habit. "And then she was gone, and I stayed." His gaze drifted toward the window where the rain had begun. Again in a thin, steady drizzle. "I thought perhaps he would come to regret it, that he would leave something to me in the end. But no, when he told me about the new will, about the child, it was like the final blow." "But it was never about the money, was it?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "It was about being forgotten." He didn't reply, but the tightening of his jaw said enough. "And yet," she went on, "you didn't act until the will was about to be signed. That's when it became real," Havelock said with a strange, almost broken laugh. "When it meant Elspeth's daughter would inherit everything and I would be dismissed, politely, of course. With a pension, perhaps, but gone all the same." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "And Mrs. Longstaff?" He turned away. "She saw me that afternoon, in the cellar, the decanter. She was always snooping about looking for opportunities. She cornered me. I tried to bluff my way through, but she said she was going to tell him. I panicked. I pushed her. She fell." "Was it an accident?" "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said defensively. I didn't want her ruining everything. I checked on her later. She was breathing. I thought she'd keep quiet, I hoped." Miss Marple exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the hush of the rain. "You do realize she may still recover?" Havelock looked at her sharply. "You haven't gone to the police?" "Not yet." He straightened, uncertain. "Why not?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "I wanted to give you the chance to tell the truth. And because I suspect there's still more to this story." At that moment, footsteps approached. The door creaked open. It was Philippa. She had paused at the threshold, clearly having heard the last few sentences. Her eyes shifted from Miss Marple to Havelock. "What is she talking about?" Havelock looked as though he might crumble. Miss Marple stood and intervened with quiet grace. "Miss Philippa, I believe you should sit. There are things you deserve to know." They sat. In the drawing-room, as the rain softened to a whisper on the windows, Miss Marple spoke clearly but gently, her tone that of a schoolteacher explaining something difficult to a child, not to belittle, but to guide with patience. "Your mother, Elspeth Monroe, was once a parlour-maid here at Fairwood Grange. She and Benedict Northwick were involved. When he cast her aside, she left alone and expecting a child." Philippa blinked rapidly. "And I was that child?" "Yes, you were adopted by the Marvels, good and honest people who never meant to keep your origins from you. But your uncle he always knew. He followed your life from a distance. When he fell ill, he decided to do what was right. He called a solicitor to draw up a new will naming you as his sole heir. But before he could sign it," she let her words trail off. Philippa turned to Havelock, her face pale. "You knew?" He didn't deny it. "I loved her," he said simply. I watched him throw her away, and then watched as he built this empire. I was here every day, every year, and I never counted. I never mattered. So you killed him, she whispered. There was no outrage in her voice, only a kind of numb grief, a deep sense of everything shifting too quickly to grasp. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched the interplay. So much of deduction was simply watching the right moment unfold. I didn't mean to kill him, Havelock said. I only meant to delay the signing. The poison was mild. Something to make him sick, to keep him bedridden, but it worked too well? Or perhaps his heart was already weak, I'll never know. Silence stretched. The clock on the mantel clicked forward. Finally, Philippa stood. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this. Miss Marple rose as well. Sometimes, my dear, it is enough to know, to understand the shape of things before deciding what must be done. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage. She passed the familiar hedgerows, the low stone wall where moss grew thickest, and the lamp-post at the bend that never quite worked right. The storm had moved off. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. As she reached her gate, she paused. Across the lane, standing behind the curtains of the vicarage, was a shadow. Reverend Chiswell. He watched her for a moment, then turned away. Miss Marple's brows knitted. Something about that moment. A flicker of recognition, an itch of suspicion, and a distant thread of memory pulling tight. She turned and stepped into her cottage, bolting the door behind her. In the stillness of her drawing room, she reached once more into her knitting bag and retrieved the notebook Havelock had given back. She hadn't had the chance to read it properly before, and as she turned to the last pages, her eyes widened. There between the servant rosters and wine inventories was a notation dated only days before Benedict's death. Calthorpe arrived. Saw him hand over envelope. BN burned it same evening. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. She whispered aloud, so the will was signed. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving Fairwood in a state of fresh-washed silence. The gravel drives glistened, the hedges dripped quietly, and the air was cool and clean, tinged faintly with wood smoke and late summer roses. The village awoke in stages, curtains twitching, kettles whistling, dogs stretching beside hearths, unaware that within one of its ivy-draped cottages a mind was already at work, knitting together threads that others had dismissed as frayed or forgotten. Miss Marple had spent most of the night rereading the small black notebook by lamplight. Its pages filled in Havelock's neat, restrained hand were more than a log of household inventory. They were, in fact, a silent witness to the final weeks of Benedict Northwick's life. Timed entries, names, visitors, meals refused. Medications taken, bottles reordered, odd remarks overheard in passing. But one note in particular returned to her mind again and again. Calthorpe arrived. Saw him hand over envelope. BN burned it same evening. Calthorpe, the solicitor from Exeter. Miss Marple remembered him well, eager, deferential, a little out of his depth, but he had been summoned, nonetheless, to draw up the new will. The valid will burned. That was the detail that troubled her. Why burn a will that you intended to sign? And if it was signed, as the notebook strongly implied, why burn it at all? She fetched her walking shoes and coat, pinning her hat securely. Before long, she was halfway to the vicarage. Reverend Chiswell was in his study, seated at his large oak desk with a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold. He rose quickly upon seeing her. Miss Marple, he said, with his usual warm gravity. A pleasure, as always. I must say, the events of the past few days have quite left me disoriented. She accepted his offered seat, her expression mild. Yes, I imagine they have. Tragedies often reveal much more than we expect. He nodded solemnly. Do you know, I've thought of poor Mrs. Longstaff each evening since the accident. Pray she pulls through? Indeed, said Miss Marple. She may yet surprise us. But I wonder, Vicar, if I might ask you something rather peculiar. He looked intrigued, folding his hands. By all means. You were quite close to Mr. Northwick, were you not? He attended services, supported the church's roof fund, and so on. Yes, yes, very generous, Chiswell agreed quickly. Though not particularly devout, but he trusted you? I believe so. He often asked my counsel, particularly as his illness progressed. Then perhaps you can help me. There's some confusion over the matter of his will. You see, the last will on record leaves the entire estate to his cousin, Miss Montague. Yes, the one who never visited. Odd, isn't it? But I've reason to believe he intended to change it, and did, in fact, sign a new one shortly before his death. Reverend Chiswell blinked. Is that so? The solicitor, Mr. Calthorpe, was called to the house. Havelock saw him deliver the envelope. Yet that same evening the envelope was burned. Why do you suppose that is? Chiswell hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, but to Miss Marple's eyes it stood out as starkly as a fingerprint on a wine glass. I suppose Benedict changed his mind, he said at last. Or perhaps the will was never signed. But it was, Miss Marple said gently. I'm quite certain. The vicar looked away, busying himself with the teacup. And what does it matter now? A will that cannot be produced is in the eyes of the law non-existent. She leaned forward slightly, unless, of course, it was hidden or replaced. He looked up sharply. Are you suggesting someone destroyed it deliberately? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She merely offered him her familiar, unassuming smile, the one people often mistook for absent-mindedness. I believe, she said, that someone had much to gain from that will disappearing, and perhaps someone else had much to lose. Chiswell stood and crossed to the window. His back was rigid. You should take care, Miss Marple. Rumors especially, in a village like ours, can be unfortunate. Oh, I never trade in rumors, she replied, rising with a rustle of skirts. Only in truths, however long they take to come to light. From the vicarage, Miss Marple made her way to the home of Mr. Harold Calthorpe in Exeter. It took the better part of the afternoon, a bus, a walk, and a bit of careful timing, but she arrived just as his clerk was closing the outer office. Mr. Calthorpe appeared flustered but polite, his ink-stained fingers nervously adjusting his collar as Miss Marple explained the nature of her inquiry. You were summoned to Fairwood Grange on the 6th of June, she said. You brought a will from Mr. Northwick to sign? Yes, I did, Calthorpe said. A very last minute matter. He rang quite unexpectedly, dictated the terms. It was all rather urgent. And he signed it in your presence? Certainly, I witnessed it myself. And where was the will kept afterward? Well, ordinarily I'd take the signed copy back to file in our vaults. But in this case, Mr. Northwick insisted on keeping it himself. He said he would lodge it in his safe that evening. Miss Marple frowned faintly. And you're absolutely certain he signed it? Calthorpe nodded vigorously, with his usual black fountain pen. I remember because the ink smudged, and he joked about it being his last mark upon the world. I admit, I thought it melodramatic at the time. And the will named Miss Philippa Marivelle as heir? He blinked. Yes, that's confidential. Information. Mr. Northwick is dead, Miss Marple said softly, and Philippa is the only family left. Calthorpe deflated. Yes, he left everything to her. Even added a codicil, leaving a stipend to Havelock. So, what happened to it? That I cannot say. He looked genuinely bewildered. I never saw it again. When I learned of his death and contacted the executors, they insisted the previous will still stood. I was well surprised. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Calthorpe. You've been very helpful. By the time she returned to St. Mary Mead, dusk had begun its slow descent. The shadows lengthened. Lamps began to glow in cottage. Windows. She passed Fairwood Grange just as the lanterns were being lit in the front hall. Someone moved past the window. Not Havelock, not Philippa, a tall silhouette. Miss Marple stopped walking. Her eyes narrowed. She retraced her steps to the gate and, after a moment's hesitation, slipped inside. The front door was ajar. Inside, the hallway was quiet. The scent of furniture polish mingled with the trace of lavender water and old stone. Miss Marple moved with practiced silence toward the study. There, rifling through the lower drawer of the walnut desk, was Reverend Chiswell. He looked up, startled. For a moment, his face so practiced in compassion and calm betrayed a flash of naked irritation. Then, quickly, it was gone. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening, "you startled me." "Did I?" she said, her voice crisp. "I might say the same of you. I was just—" Philippa asked me to find an address book. She was resting. "It's all quite innocent." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Miss Marple said, stepping forward. "Though I do wonder, if you were looking for an address book, why are you holding a fire poker?" His expression faltered. Miss Marple's gaze dropped. Indeed, he held it loosely, yet not without intent. "I think," she said, "you and I must have a very honest conversation, Reverend, before anyone else gets hurt." The fire poker felt heavy and cold in Reverend Chiswell's hand, though he held it with a firm, almost desperate grip. "Mrs. Marple's steady eyes bore into him, unflinching and unyielding, as if weighing his soul on a scale only she possessed. "Reverend," she said softly, "you don't have to do this. There's still time to speak the truth, no matter how difficult it may be." For a long moment, Chiswell said nothing. The lines on his face deepened, shadows pooling beneath his eyes as if years of strain had converged into a single unbearable decision. Finally, he set the fire poker down on the table with a soft clatter and sank into the nearest chair. "I suppose I've been hiding for too long," he began, his voice low and strained. "I never wanted to be part of this. But once it began, I found myself ensnared in a web of secrets I thought I could manage. Miss Marple folded her hands, waiting patiently. "The night Benedict Northwick died," Chiswell continued, "I was here. He sent for me in great distress. He was afraid, Miss Marple, afraid of what would happen if the new will was discovered." "And what was your role in that fear?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I advised caution, urged secrecy. He was not well, and the revelation of the new will would cause turmoil. But—" he paused, swallowing hard. "There was more. Something darker." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Go on." Chiswell glanced nervously toward the door, then back to her. "You see, I was present when Mr. Havelock confronted Benedict about the will. There was anger, threats. I tried to intervene, but it escalated." "Did it?" Miss Marple pressed. "Yes, Benedict fell, struck his head on the corner of the desk. It was an accident, but I knew Mr. Havelock panicked. I panicked." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted, but she said nothing. "I promised to protect them both," the vicar said. "To keep the truth hidden for the sake of the village, for the sake of those who would suffer if the scandal broke." "And Mrs. Longstaff's injury?" Miss Marple asked gently. Chiswell closed his eyes briefly. "She was nosy, perhaps too nosy for her own good. She saw something that night too much. I tried to warn her off, but it was no use." "And you considered using this poker?" Miss Marple gestured toward the table. He nodded, exhausted. "When she confronted me yesterday, threatening to expose everything, I thought of silencing her forever. But I could not. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You've been burdened with silence. But silence is a dangerous companion." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. "I don't understand why you kept this from Inspector Ainsworth," Miss Marple said. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Chiswell shook his head. "I feared the consequences. The scandal, the ruin of lives. It's a small village, Miss Marple. News spreads like wildfire. Innocents suffer when the truth is tangled in anger." Miss Marple reached out, placing a reassuring hand over his. "The truth, Reverend, is the foundation upon which justice stands." He sighed deeply. "I suppose it is time." Meanwhile, back at the Grange, Philippa was restless. The weight of her newly discovered heritage pressed upon her, but it was the shadows cast by those closest to her that troubled her most. Mr. Havelock's confession had shaken her, but the vicar's role introduced complexities she had never imagined. Doris, the housekeeper, had been a steady presence through the storm. Tonight she found Philippa in the library, staring blankly at the fading light through the stained glass. "Miss Philippa," Doris said gently, "are you all right?" Philippa looked up, managing a weak smile. I don't know, Doris. It feels as if the very ground beneath my feet is shifting. Doris nodded knowingly. Secrets have a way of doing that, dear, but you're not alone. Thank you, Philippa whispered. The following morning, Miss Marple convened a discreet meeting at her cottage. Inspector Ainsworth arrived with brisk efficiency, followed by Philippa and Mr. Havelock, both subdued but composed. The detective wasted no time. Miss Marple, what have you discovered? She smiled faintly. More than just the poisoner, Inspector. We have learned of an unfortunate accident, a web of fear and silence, and a desperate attempt to protect those involved. But there is still one piece missing. Ainsworth frowned. The missing will? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. The will that was burned, or so it seemed. She produced a small bundle wrapped in faded paper. This was found behind. A loose panel in the servants' quarters. An unsigned draft of the new will. Ainsworth's eyes widened. Unsigned? Not exactly, Miss Marple corrected. Look closely. Philippa stepped forward, unfolding the paper. There, beneath the signature line, is a faint imprint. The mark of a seal. Havelock leaned in, squinting. A wax seal? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. It suggests the will was prepared for signing, but was not completed. Or perhaps it was signed, then deliberately destroyed. Inspector Ainsworth tapped his chin thoughtfully. So someone wanted to erase the evidence? Miss Marple nodded. But the will itself, or fragments of it, remained hidden by mistake. This discovery changes everything. The discussion turned to motives and means. Philippa looked at Havelock. Why did you confess to the poisoning if there is more to this? Havelock sighed. I thought that would end it all. I didn't know about the will's true fate or the accident. Miss Marple added, and Reverend Chiswell's confession explains the severity of the fall. A tragic accident. Yes, but one covered by fear. Ainsworth looked grim. So who burned the will? Who destroyed the document that could have clarified everything? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe the answer lies in those last moments before Benedict's death. She turned to Philippa. Your uncle was ill, vulnerable. Someone close to him might have taken it upon themselves to safeguard their interests, perhaps by destroying the will. Philippa frowned. But who? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. We shall see. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the sky darken. A sense of finality stirred in her, yet also a hint of unease. She knew the threads were nearly unraveled, but the true pattern remained just out of sight. And somewhere in the quiet village the final move awaited. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the village of St. Aldhelm, filtering softly through the ancient oaks that lined the winding lanes. The peacefulness belied the undercurrent of tension that had taken hold since Benedict Northwick's death and the unraveling of secrets at Fairwood Grange. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage, her knitting momentarily abandoned on her lap. The gentle ticking of the clock on the mantel seemed louder than usual, as if the house itself was waiting with bated breath for what was to come. Her thoughts returned again and again to the faint wax seal imprint on the draft will, to Reverend Chiswell's uneasy confession, and to the burning question that still hung in the air, who had destroyed the signed will and why. A knock at the door interrupted her musings. It was Inspector Ainsworth. Miss Marple, he said briskly, stepping inside. I believe I have found something that may shed light on the missing will. He pulled a small package from his coat pocket and carefully placed it on the table. It was found in the fireplace at Fairwood Grange, he explained, wrapped in oilskin, partially charred, but still mostly intact. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. The missing will? Indeed, Ainsworth confirmed. Someone tried to burn it in haste, but the fire wasn't strong enough to destroy it fully. She gently untied the oilskin and unfurled the fragile parchment. The will, though scorched along the edges, bore Benedict Northwick's unmistakable signature and seal. It appears the will was burned here after the signing, Miss Marple murmured, tracing the faint wax imprint. Ainsworth frowned. Which means the destruction was deliberate, a calculated attempt to erase the new heir's claim. Miss Marple nodded. But by whom? And when? Later that day, Miss Marple returned to Fairwood Grange with Inspector Ainsworth, Philippa, and Mr. Havelock. They gathered in the dimly lit drawing-room, the atmosphere thick with unresolved questions. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple began, "about the timing of the burning and the presence of certain individuals in the house." Philippa looked anxious. "You mean someone close to my uncle?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Who?" "Had access to the study, the will, and the knowledge of its contents." She glanced at Reverend Chiswell's absence, an absence that had been increasingly notable since their last conversation. "Do you think the vicar had something to do with it?" Philippa asked hesitantly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think we cannot yet rule anything out." Ainsworth added, "I've spoken with several staff members. There's a sense that the household was divided, loyalties strained." Mr. Havelock shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I tried to keep things in order, but it wasn't easy." "Loyalty is a complicated thing," Miss Marple mused. "Sometimes it blinds us to the truth." Miss Marple excused herself for a moment, retreating to the study. She examined the fireplace where the will had been burned. The ashes had been swept away, but faint scorch marks remained on the hearth. She bent down, running her fingers over the soot and dust. Her gaze caught on a small metallic glint beneath the hearthstone. Carefully, she pried up a loose tile and found a delicate gold cufflink engraved with the initials R.C. She held it up thoughtfully. "That's Reverend Chiswell's," she murmured aloud. Returning to the others, she presented the cufflink. "This was found near the fireplace where the will was burned." Philippa's eyes widened. "But why would the vicar leave his cufflink there?" Miss Marple shrugged. "Perhaps he was in a hurry, or maybe he was startled." Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Reverend Chiswell to her cottage for tea. He arrived with a pale face and hesitant steps. "Thank you for coming, Reverend," she said kindly. He sat down, nervously adjusting his collar. "There's something I found," Miss Marple said, placing the cufflink on the table. Chiswell's hand trembled slightly as he reached for it. "I'm afraid I dropped it during the burning." He looked away. Miss Marple pressed gently. "Reverend, we must speak honestly. You knew about the will, its contents, and its significance." He nodded slowly. "I was torn," he confessed. "I wanted to protect the village, to prevent scandal, but I also feared what would happen if the truth came out." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That is a heavy burden." "I did burn the will," he admitted quietly. "I thought, if the old will remained, the estate would stay intact." "But you didn't tell anyone," she said. "No, I was ashamed." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Reverend, is there anything else?" He hesitated, then said, "There was a meeting the night before Benedict died. You weren't there." Miss Marple shook her head. "Tell me." Reverend Chiswell recounted the gathering in the library. Benedict, Philippa, Havelock, and he himself were present. They discussed the future of the estate, the new will, and the tensions it caused. "Benedict was firm," Chiswell said. "He wanted to make things right." "But," Miss Marple interjected, "someone disagreed." Chiswell swallowed. "Yes, Havelock was furious." Philippa looked at Havelock, who remained silent. Chiswell continued, "The argument escalated. I tried to calm them, but Benedict left the room angry." "And the accident?" Miss Marple asked. "He returned shortly after, and I heard a crash. When I found him, he was unconscious." Miss Marple sat quietly, piecing the puzzle together. "So it was not simply poison," she murmured. "There was also violence." Philippa's voice was small. "And all this time I thought the truth was simpler." Miss Marple smiled gently. "In matters of the heart and family, it rarely is." The next day the village felt unusually still. Miss Marple stood in the churchyard watching villagers pass. Her mind turned to the final steps needed to uncover the truth. She knew that to find the real culprit, she would have to look deeper beyond the surface of guilt and confession, because in every shadow there lay a secret waiting to be unveiled. The morning air in St. Aldhelm was crisp, carrying a hint of autumn's arrival as Miss Marple made her way slowly along the village lane. The familiar crunch of fallen leaves underfoot was comforting, a steady rhythm against the whirlwind of recent events at Fairwood Grange. Her thoughts, however, were far from settled. Since Reverend Chiswell's reluctant confession and the discovery of the partially burned will, the pieces of the puzzle had shifted and multiplied. Yet Miss Marple felt the truth, the final thread that would unravel the entire tangled skein was still just beyond reach. She paused at the edge of the village green where a group of locals had gathered, their voices low and wary. The sight reminded her of how quickly fear and suspicion could spread like wildfire in a small community, and how the most innocent gestures could hide the deepest secrets. Miss Marple returned to her cottage where Philippa awaited, her expression pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," Philippa began, "I've been thinking about the night my uncle died." "About what, Reverend?" Chiswell said, "About the argument." "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged. "I need to be honest with you," Philippa said, hesitating. "I was there that evening, though I didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I suspected as much." Philippa took a deep breath. "I wanted to speak to my uncle alone, to ask him to explain why he'd kept so many secrets, but the conversation turned heated. Havelock came in just as things were growing tense." "And what happened next?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Philippa's voice trembled. "Words were exchanged, harsh words. I left before anything happened, before Benedict's fall." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You said you left." "But where?" Philippa swallowed. "The garden." "I wandered there for a while." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, recalling the late evening walks she herself had taken by the rose bush near the east wing. "And did you see anyone else out there?" she asked softly. Philippa hesitated. "Yes, Reverend Chiswell." Miss Marple's expression tightened. "Together?" "No, he was alone. But when I stepped closer, I heard voices coming from the library window." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. "Voices?" "Yes, my uncle and Mr. Havelock arguing fiercely." That evening Miss Marple arranged for Philippa, Havelock, and Reverend Chiswell to meet in the drawing-room at Fairwood Grange. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with unspoken questions. Miss Marple spoke calmly. "I believe the argument you heard was crucial. It explains much about the anger and fear that filled that night." Havelock's eyes flickered with unease. "It was a difficult time. Benedict was not himself." Reverend Chiswell looked down. "Nor was I," Philippa spoke up, voice steady. "But there is something else. Something no one has said." All three looked toward her. "I saw someone leave the house just before I went to the garden. Someone wearing gloves, a dark coat. I didn't recognize who." Havelock's jaw clenched. "Why didn't you say this before?" "I was afraid," Philippa admitted. "Afraid it would only make things worse." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Fear often keeps us silent, but truth has a way of emerging." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple questioned each person carefully, drawing out details, watching reactions. She noted how Reverend Chiswell's hands trembled when asked about the gloves, how Havelock's eyes darted when Philippa mentioned the stranger, how Philippa herself seemed both haunted and determined. Then, with a knowing smile, Miss Marple rose and announced, "I think it is time we all visit the garden." The moon was high and full when they stepped outside. The air was cool and fragrant with damp earth and crushed leaves. Miss Marple led the way toward the east wing rose garden, its petals ghostly pale in the moonlight. She stopped beside a cluster of bush. "This is where I believe the final piece lies." She crouched and brushed aside leaves to reveal faint footprints pressed into the soft soil, too large to be Philippa's, too small for Havelock's. Reverend Chiswell's face paled. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Who among you wears size 9 boots?" The vicar hesitated, then slowly lifted one foot, revealing worn leather shoes that matched the print. A hush fell. Miss Marple rose. "And these," she continued, pointing to a delicate, folded glove caught in the bramble, "belonged to someone who tried to cover their tracks but forgot the smallest detail." She held up the glove. "They are finely made, and, Reverend, you might recognize them." Chiswell swallowed hard but said nothing. Back inside, Miss Marple gathered them in the drawing room once more. "Reverend, I believe you went out into the garden that night, perhaps after the argument." He looked at her, defeated. "Yes." Miss Marple continued, "You were not alone." "Someone else followed you," Philippa gasped softly. "Who?" Havelock demanded. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Someone whose motives went beyond loyalty or fear. Someone desperate to protect their own claim." She turned slowly to face Reverend Chiswell. His composure cracked. "It was Montague," a breath caught in the room. "Your cousin?" Miss Marple said quietly. Chiswell nodded. She arrived unexpectedly that night. Angry, demanding, desperate. She saw the new will and realized her inheritance was at risk. She confronted Benedict? Yes, the argument grew heated. She threatened to reveal his secrets, ruin him. And when Benedict refused to change his mind? Things got out of hand. She pushed him. He stumbled backward, hit his head on the desk. Philippa's eyes filled with tears. "And the will?" "Montague tried to destroy it," Chiswell said, voice breaking. "She burned the document in the fireplace," Miss Marple added, but in her haste she left behind clues. The door opened abruptly, and a tall woman entered, face flushed, and eyes sharp, Miss Montague herself. She stood, defiant and unrepentant. "I suppose you have all come to accuse me," she said coldly. Miss Marple smiled serenely. "We have come to understand the truth." Montague's gaze swept the room, lingering on Philippa. "Do you know what it is to be robbed of your rightful inheritance?" She spat. "To have the family name dragged through the mud?" Philippa spoke firmly. "No, I only know what it is to be honest." Montague laughed bitterly. "Honesty? That's a luxury, isn't it?" The final confrontation was at hand. Miss Marple stepped forward, calm but commanding. "Miss Montague, the evidence against you is undeniable. Your footprints, the glove, your presence that night." Montague's face paled. "You destroyed the will to protect your claim, pushed Benedict to his death, and tried to silence those who knew too much." Montague's composure broke. "I did what I had to," she said, voice trembling. "For the family name," Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The family name is only as strong as the truth that upholds it." As the village prepared for the inevitable reckoning, Miss Marple stood quietly in her garden, knitting needles clicking softly. The tangled threads had been unraveled, the shadows lifted, but the gentle wisdom that had guided her throughout whispered softly in the evening breeze, "In every secret lies a lesson, and in every truth the chance for redemption." The morning following Miss Montague's confession dawned quiet and pale. The village hushed in that peculiar way it falls silent after a storm. The clouds had lifted, yet their memory lingered, heavy and gray in the corners of the day. At Fairwood Grange, the air seemed lighter somehow, though the events of the past week left a residue of sorrow on every polished banister and shuttered window. Miss Marple sat in the small sunlit sitting room of her cottage, her knitting untouched. In her lap, she had just come from the police station, where she had formally given her statement. Inspector Crail, ever brisk and slightly embarrassed by her involvement, had thanked her in his usual understated fashion. "Well, Miss Marple," he'd muttered, adjusting his hat, "once again, you've managed to uncover more in a week than we could in a month." She had only smiled politely, murmuring something vague about patterns in human nature. Now she sipped her tea slowly, watching the birds dart in and out of her rose bush. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was contemplative. For even though the truth had been uncovered, the village itself would take time to heal. At Fairwood Grange, Philippa wandered the hallways alone, her steps tentative, thoughtful. The manor no longer felt like a battlefield of secrets. It was as if some invisible fog had lifted from its walls, allowing it to breathe again. She stood at the doorway of Benedict Grant's old study. The door creaked softly as she opened it. The scent of books and wax polish lingered, though the room felt still, as though exhaling for the first time in years. On the desk sat the scorched corner of the new will, the only fragment that had survived. Montague's hasty attempt at destruction. Though the original document was gone, The testimony of witnesses and forensic experts would be enough to establish its legitimacy. The solicitor had confirmed it earlier that morning. Philippa Grant would inherit Fairwood Grange. She did not smile. The victory felt heavy. She had never desired the estate for wealth or position, but only for the sense of belonging it once promised. Now, with Benedict gone and Montague awaiting trial, the home seemed to carry more obligation than reward. Still, she turned and began to gather the unopened letters on the desk, determined to face the legacy that had fallen to her, however bittersweet. Reverend Cheesewell stood by the gate of the churchyard, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He watched as 2 constables led Montague down the stone path, her hands lightly restrained, her face blank with exhaustion. She offered no resistance. Only a distant glance at the church she had once attended with reverence. He bowed his head briefly as she passed. Miss Marple, who had arrived moments earlier, approached him quietly. "You did the right thing," she said gently. Cheesewell gave a hollow sigh. It didn't feel like it at the time. "No," she agreed, "it seldom does." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the wind pass through the yew trees. Cheesewell looked down the path toward the vicarage, then back toward the retreating figure of Montague. "She was lost long before that night," he murmured. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "Grief twists people. Pride hardens them, and fear, well, it can lead even the cleverest into ruin." He nodded slowly, shoulders slumping with age and weariness. "I've spent my life preaching about forgiveness," he said. "And now I find I must learn it all over again." Miss Marple laid a gloved hand gently on his arm. "Then perhaps you'll preach it all the better for it." The village resumed its rhythms gradually. At the post office, Mrs. Langtry gossiped in more hushed tones. At the grocer's, old Mr. Tyler wrapped cheese with extra care, as though the paper might hold something delicate beyond food. Conversations paused as Philippa passed, but the tone was no longer judgmental, only uncertain. Miss Marple paid her a visit a few days later. They sat in the east drawing-room, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Philippa had rearranged the furniture slightly, nothing drastic, just enough to feel new. "You're not leaving," Miss Marple observed. Philippa smiled faintly. "No, I thought about it. But Fairwood was my uncle's dream. He may not have been a perfect man, but he wanted this house to be lived in, loved." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "He was flawed, but most of us are. That doesn't make his intention any less real." Philippa turned toward the window. "Montague's trial will be public, won't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But I imagine it won't be a lengthy affair." Her confession was quite thorough. The motive is sadly familiar: inheritance, pride, and desperation. Philippa sighed. "I wonder what my uncle would have done had he lived." Miss Marple smiled wryly. "Probably changed the will again." That earned a soft laugh from Philippa, the first in days. A week later, Inspector Crail returned to Miss Marple's cottage, his hat in hand. "We've confirmed the timeline," he said without preamble. Montague arrived in the village the evening of the storm, just before the power cut. She entered through the servants' quarter. One of the footmen recognized her, but thought it best not to interfere. Miss Marple nodded. "No one likes interfering with family matters, especially when money's involved." Crail exhaled. She confronted Benedict about the new will, and when he wouldn't budge, things turned violent. He fell, struck his head. She panicked, tried to burn the will. The fire was too slow, and the vicar arrived. He tried to help, but Montague threatened to blame him if he spoke. "A wicked form of blackmail," Miss Marple murmured. "She's confessed to it all now. Solicitors drawn up the official restitution. Miss Grant will inherit." He paused. "And you were right about the glove." Miss Marple looked modestly pleased. "It's always the little things, Inspector." As the summer waned, Fairwood Grange began to find its new rhythm under Philippa's quiet but steady hand. She reopened the gardens to the public on Sundays and donated half the estate's harvest to the village school fund. Her late uncle's name was honored with a modest scholarship for local students interested in horticulture or estate management. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her usual pursuits: morning walks, reading, quiet cups of tea. Life, she knew, would never be free of tragedy, but in the small triumphs of truth, justice, and human decency, there was always solace. She sat one afternoon in the rose garden, where it had all begun, her knitting clicking softly as sparrows darted through the hedges. The wind rustled the petals gently, like whispers from a world just out of sight. She looked up once, thoughtfully, toward the old bell tower in the distance. Another case concluded, another heart mended, another lesson learned. For Miss Marple there was always the next quiet puzzle, and always, always the truth. The end.